Thank you. Well, Susan, thank you very much for those words of introduction, and this is a lovely occasion for me to be here, and I congratulate the winners of those prizes. I must say that a special pleasure for me over the last 2 years has been the chance to be connected with the University of the South Pacific. This is the third visit I've been able to make in the last couple of years, and it's been a great privilege for me and very enjoyable to get the chance to meet people here and to learn more about this special place. And I have to say that my appreciation of the place of this institution in the region is far greater than it was. My admiration for what you do is unbounded. I think it's an extraordinarily important university which does great things. I admire especially your willingness to undergo a process of great change, of great demand, which is not easy, but it's going to work, and it is change that you will feel in the end makes this an even more special place. It's been a pleasure for me to work with the Vice-Chancellor and Susan, but also to have the chance earlier to meet the deans and heads of school and senior administrative staff, and to learn just about the depth of leadership that you're able to draw on in this place. I'm not going to be talking about change at Melbourne in particular. I want to instead talk about what I see to be some of the teaching and learning challenges that we face as people involved with students. I've been involved in teaching students for decades and decades, from a time when as a student I was a gog when someone actually wrote on the board with chalk, let alone actually showed a 35mm slide. And I continue to find the challenges and the possibilities of teaching very exciting, and I'm going to be sharing some of my thoughts about those with you today and looking forward to learning from you at the same time. But you're going through a process of extraordinary change, and the initial point I want to make to you is this. Universities are very good at adding things. Universities are always going through processes of accretion, of putting on new courses, new programs, etc., etc. We're not so good at saying, let's stop doing something. Or why don't we have a good hard look at everything we do? What you're doing at the University of the South Pacific is in fact what a significant number of really good universities are doing all around the world. That's to say, you're no longer simply saying, let's do a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that. You're actually saying, let's have a good hard look. Let's work out a strategy for making this an even better place of higher education. This is a process that is going on all over the world, and it has to take into account the specificities of every university. There is no one model in the world for the sort of curriculum change that is going on wherever we look. Every institution has to look at what it's doing and what it hopes its future will be, and to decide just what are its strategic objectives. One of the critical things, however, is that this is change that affects everybody in the university. Certainly we have found at Melbourne, and I don't know you've found here, that what might start off as discussions about curriculum fundamentally involve everybody in the whole university in the end, because everything down to student systems and student support ends up being part of this process of change. But as I say, the actual nature of the change varies from place to place. Just to give you a very few examples, at the start of next year, the University of Western Australia in Perth will be introducing a graduate school model very like that of the University of Melbourne, whereby its professional graduate accredited programs all shift to graduate level. That's their idea of general curriculum change. The University of Aberdeen in Scotland has recently gone through a wholesale process of curriculum change, keeping its 4-year undergraduate degrees, but introducing a number of what you're calling generic courses. They call them 6th century courses because it's to celebrate 600 years of the University of Aberdeen. But they've made a decision that there are certain core subjects that every undergraduate student should be invited to take, rather like what you're doing here. The University of Hong Kong, another example of wholesale curriculum change. They decided that they were going to bring their university into alignment with mainland China to shift to 4-year undergraduate programs. But rather than simply say, well, we'll make our undergraduate programs longer, they said, why don't we think of them differently and actually add in, again, some generic programs within those undergraduate degrees. Fabulous courses, by the way, that they've devised. I know that Professor Adrian Wood last year in the talk that he gave, and which I've listened to on the web, gave you another example of curriculum change at his particular university. So there are examples. You're one, I think, in a select group of universities that's undergoing this very important process. It is difficult. It is difficult for all sorts of reasons. Once we start talking about what sort of curriculum we want in a university, inevitably there are sensitivities. At worst, there can even be curriculum wars, as we came to call them at the University of Melbourne. Why is one area of the curriculum more important than the other? If we're going to have generic courses, why this and not something else? These are difficult choices that require leadership. We're dealing with colleagues who, after all, have an enormous amount invested of their persona in what they've been doing for years, even decades. It is terribly difficult to say to our colleagues, we think we need to think radically differently about what it is that you are teaching, what it is that I am teaching. People are proud of what they've developed over years, even decades. Asking people to change is inevitably very difficult. It requires a shift in culture for all staff. It's a major challenge for university leadership. The rewards are very great too. And in the case of the University of the South Pacific, I think they are stark. I think that quite apart from making yourself plainly the best university in the region, you have the opportunity of being seen as a very fine university beyond the region. I think you have the opportunity for a heightened level of inherent satisfaction with the place at which you work, knowing that you've gone through a process of saying, what is the best curriculum we can devise for our students for the 21st century? And we've done it. The levels of satisfaction that can be achieved in that way are not to be downplayed. But the change is very great. This is the sort of change we went through at Melbourne, which is parallel in terms of magnitude to yours. We shifted from 96 to just 6 undergraduate degrees. People had to stop teaching degrees they'd always taught, because we were shifting to professional level degrees for professional programs. Every single degree program in the university had to be revised, just as it is here. Fundamentally, in terms of course advising and course planning, we had to rely on people at faculty level talking about course advice to students in a very different way. That no longer were people in the science faculty office talking about how you kept studying science. They were also needing to say to students, have you thought of being a teacher? Have you thought of applying for law school? Have you thought of applying to medical school? Similarly, at the University of the South Pacific, you are being asked, and it's a fundamental challenge, to look at every single course, every single program from that triple perspective of relevance, sustainability and quality. Every single program that you offer has to be examined with fresh eyes. What is the best bachelor's program in this area that we can devise? These are ambitious goals, they're crucial goals. Of course, there are other goals as well, and these are the overriding ones. Because of fundamental importance in all of this is that what you've decided to do through STAR is to say, how do we best prepare our students for success in the changing world of the 21st century? That maybe, as at the University of Melbourne, as at other universities around the world, what we've been offering our students at the close of the 20th century is no longer quite what it needs to be as we move beyond the first decade of the new century. The key dimension, of course, the key challenge underpinning the whole STAR project is around employability, is around your students and their prospects for the future. What I want to do today, however, is to raise a series of questions about how best we might get there. That's to say, it's one thing to say we want to educate the best graduates, we want to make sure our programs are relevant, of high quality, they're sustainable. What I want to do is to raise a series of 4 questions about the way we educate our students. How do we make sure that the education that we're offering is of the highest possible quality? As I said, I've been teaching for a long time, and as I thought what I wanted to say today and talk to you about, these are the things that struck me as being issues that I think are particularly pertinent. It also struck me that even though the University of Melbourne and the University of the South Pacific in some ways are radically different institutions, that in so many other ways we share the same goals, the same objectives, the same aspirations, and the same challenges. So what I'm saying to you in my talk this afternoon is that there are a series of challenges that I think that university educators face, and I think what I say is going to have a particular pertinence to you, just as it does for me. The first of them has to do with the particular ways we go about educating Gen Y in terms of the new technologies. As you know as well as I do, over the past 20 years, we've lived through a revolution in information and the way it's disseminated that is every bit as important as the invention of the printing press in 1455 by Gutenberg, or as the mechanisation of those printing presses in the early decades of the 19th century. University libraries remain very special repositories of print and of microform, but are increasingly gateways into digitised databases. Students are just as likely to access information through those databases and through the internet as through subject websites. Only a minority of our students routinely spend the day, as we did, passing backwards and forwards between classroom and desk in a library. Their life has become rather more complicated. You and I share the objectives of campus-based education. You and I believe that education has a special dimension when it is face-to-face between staff and students. We also know that that's not always possible, but in particular we know that that face-to-face interaction can be and must be enriched in ways that are informed by the extraordinary richness of the new technologies. But it is not a simple matter. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I had a bright idea, I thought, at the start of this year. One of the things that has always exercised me at the University of Melbourne, and as its senior academic officer, has been, given that we have about 8,000 new students a year, how do you go about creating a sense of cohort among students when you're dealing with numbers of that magnitude? And I know that you have around 4,000, I think, new students each year. How do you go about doing that? And I thought, well, how about we get every new first-year student in the university to read the same book, the same work of fiction before they arrive. And I was very excited about this. Nam Le won all sorts of awards. He's the son of Vietnamese refugees from the 1980s who arrived in Melbourne. A brilliant writer. He's won every award under the sun for this collection of short stories. We did a special deal with Penguin Books so that we were able to provide every single first-year student with a copy of this book for $5. And they would rock up on enrolment day and we'd say, right, go off to the bookshop and there's your book. Read it and we're going to start talking. We know that a huge number of students did so, bought it and even read it. The problem we had was when we started to look for ways, so how do we start talking about this before students arrive for class? We wanted them to spend January and February somehow online talking to each other. We thought this would be a wonderful way to get them to start interacting. We thought we'd send them an email, inviting them to join email discussion groups. As one student rather archly said to me, we don't read emails anymore. So we thought, well, how will we do this? We'll try Facebook. We'll start a Facebook discussion forum around Nam Le's collection of short stories. And then we got a rebuff from students saying, get out of our space. This is where we do our social interaction. It's social media. It's not university property. We found a real problem in how to communicate, to know we've communicated with every student. And it really highlighted for me some of the challenges of the new digital age. What are the best ways to engage students in some type of online discussion that's outside their strict subject parameters? We're going to try it again this year, and we'll try and be a little bit more effective. But it really highlighted to me some of the challenges around this whole cliche, I guess, about the students we educate, and that is that they're digital natives. That's the term that we use in Australia. That's to say, more and more people say to old laggards like me, Peter, you've got to understand that the students that you're educating in the early 21st century are adept at every form of interactive media. Usually they're using 2 or 3 at once. And if you use something as old-fashioned as email or as private as Facebook, you're in trouble. There is a myth, however, around this. We've done a huge amount of work at the University of Melbourne in trying to ascertain just to what extent are our students digital natives? How sophisticated are they? And what does that mean for the way that we communicate with them and the way we teach them? What we found in particular was that only a small minority of our students, even though our students are on the whole affluent, sophisticated, urban, we found that only about 15% of them are what we would call digital natives in the sense that they are using multiple media all of the time. There were lots of people, probably half of our students, who are in fact at the far end of the spectrum, who use just basic telephony and the internet. The most sophisticated students we have, by the way, in terms of IT in our university are international students doing architecture, particularly from Hong Kong. They've always got about 4 things going on. And the least sophisticated were Melbourne students doing arts, who are about as sophisticated as me. They use the internet, they use text messaging, forget the rest. When we said to our students, what do you want in terms of the university's provision of IT? What was really striking was that the vast majority of them said, do the basics and get it right. We want you to just concentrate on the most basic form of student information services, learning management systems, the really essential stuff, access, 24/7, reliability, speed, that's what we're concerned about. Don't worry about the fancy stuff, leave that to us, just do the really essential stuff properly. We had real problems this year with our new student system called ISIS. One of the reasons why I couldn't get online discussions going about Nam Lee's collection of short stories was that every time we tried to put something on Facebook, join the discussion, there was a flood of messages about the difficulties of using the student system, which was then called by the students crisis rather than ISIS. We have to do that a whole lot better. The same, by the way, applies to staff. We know that there is an increasing richness of online tools that we can use in our teaching, and we've already heard that referred to by the Vice-Chancellor, and mobile teaching technologies. But increasingly we're finding in various parts of the university that things like simulated environments and applications are critically important in the area of health sciences in particular. But again, in terms of what we ask of our staff, we need to be attuned to the fact that there are 2 extremes of innovators at one end who use that stuff routinely with their students, and laggards at the other, people like me, who are content to use LMS, learning management system applications of a fairly basic kind. We need to be very careful as universities as we provide a richer IT environment that we're continuing to do the essential stuff really well at a very high level of reliability and sophistication. I think there are other questions about the place of the new technologies in teaching, and these are they. I think the third one there is absolutely fundamental, by the way. We have in Australia a nationwide survey the April after students graduate, the April after they finish their degrees, and there are about 70,000 students around the country who get a survey which is called the Course Experience Survey. What did you think of your course at your university? It's a fabulous survey because it looks at academic matters and the whole course and the whole sort of campus experience as well. And as with those sorts of surveys, there's usually one question that goes to the heart of the matter. And when I ask my colleagues in our Centre for the Study of Higher Education, what's the crucial thing that determines what students think of their time at the university, they say there's a question in there which says this, or asks this. Did you feel part of a learning community? Or did you feel part of a community of students and staff committed to learning? And they said to me that the student response to that is what determines fundamentally their attitude to everything else. If students at the end of their education say, yes, I felt part of a community and it was about learning, if they have a positive response to that, a whole lot of other things flow. I think one of the challenges with the new technologies is to think through, now how might we use those technologies to enhance that? Are there ways, I mean we think at Melbourne we use the term local and overseas students. I think you use the terms local and regional students, but there are similar challenges. How might we use the new technologies to do something about providing a sense of community? That was what I was trying to do with that novel by Nam Le, that collection of short stories. I thought if we can get some international students from Singapore and China and the Middle East starting to talk to Melbourne students online about this collection of short stories about the world, what a wonderful thing that would be in terms of community. That's still our goal. Think about that. But think fundamentally of that final point too. There have to be really serious equity considerations at every point about the new technologies. We mustn't run the risk of leaving students behind. I still remember when our Director of E-Learning at Melbourne, when we decided that we would record all of our lectures, the slides and the voiceover and all the rest of it, which has been a boon as far as our students are concerned. I can still remember when we had discussions with him about making that available through mobile phones and so on, when some people said, well, that's the only way it should be available. And he just said, don't forget that there are 1% of our students who don't have mobile phones. It sounds a great idea, but what are you going to do about that 1%? And they tend to be poorer kids from overseas or from the western suburbs of Melbourne. You mustn't leave people behind when it comes to IT provision. I think this question of the provision of IT is linked to the second major question that I want to raise with you today, and that is about the nature of study and teaching spaces. And I was so pleased when in his introductory remarks today the Vice-Chancellor said to you that part of the discussion that you have here about teaching and learning needs to be about infrastructure, IT and other things as well. This is a beautiful campus. I think the University of Melbourne has a beautiful campus too. One of the challenges that we've had over the years, I must say, is that there were worrying signs that too many of our students didn't, however, find it the place they necessarily wanted to be. They were able to do most of their sophisticated IT stuff elsewhere, often at home, and they didn't necessarily find the sorts of study spaces congenial. They weren't the sort of places that you and I had grown up studying in. We have become, at the University of Melbourne, I think, rather locked into the idea that teaching and learning takes place in lecture theatres and tutorial or seminar rooms or laboratories. And when students need to do their own work, they go to the library. And they sit in similar places that you and I sat in. And we weren't altogether sure that that was the way that the students necessarily wanted to be taught or that they wanted to use space in terms of their own study. It was a particularly acute challenge for us because we were moving to a situation where from 75% of our students being undergraduates, we're moving to a situation where 50% of them are graduate students. There's been a massive shift in the nature of our students. Our students are increasingly older, more sophisticated, they have different responses to space. And it gave us the impulse to say, when we think about providing space or refurbishing space, I wonder if it's worthwhile asking the question about how students best learn these days, or how they like to study best. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about, and I could give you many more. And these are not expensive, by the way, because all universities have programs of refurbishment of old teaching spaces that get too tatty. We also have programs, of course, of building new spaces. This was an old chemistry theatre, which was on our list. It's due for an upgrade, and boy was it due for an upgrade. It had become almost a museum of audio-visual equipment. You can see, I think, about 6 archaeological levels of AV in that theatre, can't you? From this object up the back, I'm not quite sure what it is. You can see what this is down the front. An early form of PowerPoint projector. I suspect these boxes had video cassettes. But all sorts of things. Cluttered, unattractive, unappealing. No one actually liked teaching in there. It's where you went if your class wasn't particularly big, but only had about 80 students. You taught there under sufferance. As we shifted to a different type of teaching model, we thought maybe we could do something different with a space like that. And this is what a colleague of mine came up with. He said, why don't we use the natural camber of this little old lecture theatre to create 4 different levels where students can work either in groups of 4, or they can swing these tables out and they can work in groups of 8. They've all got their own screens to work on as in small groups, or at the appropriate time they can share their work with other people on large screens. The lecturer, if necessary, can stand in a spot at the middle here and give a lecture of whatever length. They even designed a spot right up at the back here, you can just see that yellow counter, where people from our education faculty could observe what was going on in terms of student learning, because it was a type of teaching laboratory that was being envisaged. We find that the bookings for this particular classroom now are 8 to 6, 5 days a week, and the graduate students have a swipe card to use it at the weekends so that they can get in there and work in small groups and so on. It was amazing the impact it had, because people that went there started saying, how come they've got one and we haven't? In particular, the impact was felt in this I think very beautiful old building, but a building that was in a terribly sad state 10 years ago. This is our Melbourne School of Engineering, a building that went up in the 1880s and which 10 years ago was inside dingy, dilapidated, cluttered, largely used for unconsulted back sets of engineering journals which are all online. It was pretty much in tune with the attitude of that faculty towards teaching, actually. My colleagues in engineering won't mind me saying this, but theirs was a faculty which had the record as being the faculty with the poorest response in terms of the quality of teaching, learning and what students thought. They excused themselves on 2 grounds, one by saying we have very high standards, it's too tough for the students. The second excuse often was to say, as one dean said to me one day, I said, look, we've got to do something about your student surveys. And he said to me, Peter, you've got to understand that we're a research faculty, not a teaching faculty. We benefited from a Commonwealth grant around teaching and learning, and I siphoned off a chunk of that and said to the dean, I want you to use this person who's just done the chemistry theatre, and I want you to do up one classroom. I want you to find a way of making one classroom a place where students will learn collaboratively as they do in chemistry. And just see what it's like. Just see what happens. They came up with then a similar model up here, a collaborative classroom. And then they, and here's a better view of it. It was actually in an old, it was down in the lower level of the engineering building. It was the storeroom. It was the place where you put all the old junk. All the broken equipment or the stuff that no one wanted, you shoved it in the basement. We cleaned it out and we used some of the old pulleys and so on almost as a way of expressing the history of the place to engineering students. But we put a whole series of tables that could take about 60 students where they could work in groups of 3 or 6 at their tables, or the whole group could work together. It had a similar reaction to what had happened in chemistry. The faculty took the bait, as I desperately hoped they would. And not only did they refurbish every classroom in the whole building, but they then said, we want to create some sort of informal study spaces. Because we have all these students who sort of hang around after class and they've got nowhere special to go, they don't like going to the library. And they created what they called the Engineering Learning Centre. It was fascinating. This specialist that, as I said, worked for me, simply designed a series of different types of spaces, quite formal tables, benches, but also some terribly informal spaces with couches, armchairs and whatever, and just let the students colonise those areas as places to work. It was fascinating. Just to watch how an individual student or a group of students would come in looking for a place to work on an assignment and say, do we need to go to the room where we can lock the door and work together on our collaborative project? Or do I need to find a little niche where I can work by myself? Or do I need to just chill out with my mates and set up our laptops and have a chat as we work? They found what suited them. I used to sort of, when I felt like a break from my desk job, I'd sometimes used to just sneak over there and look. And it was fascinating. Work, 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 chat, chat, chat about work. I'd look over their shoulders. They weren't doing emails. They were working. Some of my colleagues said to me, this is crazy. You're providing a Qantas Club lounge for these students. They'll nick the armchairs, they'll scratch them, they'll pour coffee all over them, etc., etc. Nothing happened. The students went in there and thought, wow, this is for us. And 3 years later, those furnishings are still in extremely good condition. There's a challenge then about spaces that I find fascinating. What are the best spaces in which to teach and learn and study? I think it's connected with my third point, which is about the place of research and learning about research in our universities. I downloaded some of your strategic goals from your website. And not surprisingly, as one would expect in a university of this standing, a great deal of stress is placed on research. Almost to the point that you would say this is a research-led university. Research is at the heart of this university's project. The relevance of our degrees in our research in priority areas. Top quality teaching and research staff. What about the challenges of teaching in a research-led university? One of the key outcomes of STAR quite specifically says, explicitly says, that it wants to take further this connection between teaching and research. Among your graduate attributes that you prize most highly are research, literacy and skills. What I think it's worth focusing on, however, is what these things actually mean in practice. Academics around the world would say, oh yes, teaching and research, the nexus. But if you actually said, reflect on that and let's talk about how we do it, what it means. I think it's a whole lot more than simply being able to say, look, my current research project is this to students. I think it's about a lot more than saying, this is the sort of research that I'm doing. Let me explain what I mean. And I think it's fundamentally important because to my mind, what distinguishes a university from any other form of higher education or from any other form of education, and what distinguishes in particular a fine university like this one, is that research is at the heart of the matter. And that research and teaching are intimately linked in all sorts of ways. ways that go well beyond, as I say, simply talking about the latest research that we're doing. I noticed that, and I noticed with great admiration, that one of the most upfront attributes that you want your graduates to have is a belief in intellectual integrity, a respect for truth, a respect for the ethics of research. And I think that is what is crucially important. When we talk about research and the research teaching nexus in a university like this, to my mind, it is the way in which we're introducing students to the methodologies of research, to the ethics of research. And that has to be the case for people who are not researchers themselves, people who are teaching only scholars in a university. What defines the nature of learning in a university like this or like mine needs to be that we're not only talking to students about the actual research that we're doing, but we're actually saying to students, this is how you do it. These are the methodologies. This is how research happens. This is how we learn new things. This is how knowledge happens. And underpinning those methodologies are certain ethics of research which help us to define what is a university education. I think the way that you and I talk to our students about research, about knowledge, about how to test it, about how to add to it, is what makes places like this special. We are not simply instructing students, we're introducing them to the life of the mind in its critical, original sense, its relationship with knowledge. Look at the way a couple of other people have put what I've been saying. A former leader of mine, Alan Gilbert, who was a Vice-Chancellor at Melbourne and who went on to be Vice-Chancellor at the University of Manchester. At the end of that first paragraph, we introduce students to the methodology, challenges and ethics of research, the process of knowledge creation. There's something about ethics and values in the practice of research that are at the heart of what we talk about to students as being the values of a university. Bernard Shapiro, former Vice-Chancellor of McGill University in Canada. North Americans often talk about moral education at universities. We're a little uncomfortable about that in this part of the world, talking about moral education. We're more comfortable talking about the ethics, the values that we seek to imbue. But for Bernard Shapiro, the point about having students at a research-based university is that they are able to ask moral or ethical questions, to make ethical judgments. That is at the heart of the project of higher education. The key point that I'm wanting to make to you is this. Whether we think about it consciously or not, whether our students think about it consciously or not, all of us in the way that we interact with knowledge in front of our students are role models or mentors. When students hear us talking about the subject matter that we feel passionate about, when they hear us talking about the way research is done, what are the difficulties of research, what are the debates in research, the criticisms, the sensitivities, the ambiguities, when our students listen to us doing that and watch us doing that, they are looking at us as mentors. The way that Dr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so interacts with that body of knowledge, interrogates it, introduces us to it, is the way that I learn as a student to interact with knowledge. There is no more important thing that happens in a university, to my mind, than the way in which teaching staff introduce students to the ethics and methodologies of research. Because that is the underpinning of what Dr. Shapiro was talking about, of a moral education at a university level. It is the great privilege of university education. The opportunity in front of young minds to say, here is important research about important questions. And this is how I engage with it. This is how I interrogate it. This is what I find unsatisfactory about some of it. These are the ambiguities, the moral dilemmas in some of that research. These are the political dilemmas. We are introducing students to a whole series of values, in other words. And it connects with my fourth and final point. Again, drawing on something that I've taken from your website, the university's own statement about its vision for what it wants to be. And it's a wonderful statement. Whoever wrote this, it's a really beautiful statement about the point of the University of the South Pacific, about its general hopes for a broad education, but its great pride in being the eminent institution of the South Pacific. Look at that final sentence in particular. Understanding and respect for diversity, equality, tolerance and justice should be reinforced by the university experience. I just said that I think that a really fundamental way of doing that is the way we talk about research ethics, research methodologies. It's a similar point. I think what we're talking about, in other words, is the cultivation among our students of respectful minds. I think universities have to be fundamentally about respect in all sorts of dimensions. We are offering education in citizenship. I said as I began this presentation that even though our two universities were very different in all sorts of stark ways, we share so many things in common in terms of our hopes for our students, the nature of the institutions that we want to work in. We have so much in common that when you talk about the attributes of your graduates in these ways which I know must be very familiar to you now, they're so similar to the attributes that we worked out at the University of Melbourne. We have rather fewer because we have a whole lot of subheadings under those attributes. But what both USP and the University of Melbourne were saying was two things really. We want our students to have a really top quality education in their chosen area, state of the art, high quality, rigorous, something that will set them up for a lifetime of effective work. We also want them, secondly, to be wonderful citizens, to be attuned to diversity, to appreciate diversity, to be proud of diversity, to be willing to be leaders. Those two dimensions of the university experience. Some years ago, as I talked about the importance of community in universities, one of my colleagues said to me, "Peter, I'd like you to go away and describe what you mean by community and what sort of community the University of Melbourne ought to be." This is what I came up with, and I'm wondering how close it is to the sort of community you would like USP to be. This is what I wrote down. And I'm not going to read out every word, but when I said this is the sort of community that I think the University of Melbourne should aspire to be and say so to its students, I said these things. One, educationally focused. That's the core. Secondly, an articulate and open community. We want it to be an international community. We want it to be a lively place. We want it to be abuzz with things going on. We want it to be fair. We want students to feel that they are in a place of higher learning which is fair in all ways, which is principled, where we're quite explicit about academic honesty, about ethics, about the way we expect staff and students to respect each other. A caring community. And harking back to what the Vice-Chancellor said about not wanting to be a university that forgets, we want to be a university that is aware of itself, of what it's learnt, of where it's come from. We want it to celebrate its achievements, to remember achievements in the past. We want it to be, in other words, an education in citizenship. I suspect that even though I wrote those words about my own big city, primarily middle-class university across the sea, I suspect that many of those values about what is a learning community would be ones that you would adhere to. A point by way of conclusion. So much of what I've been talking about today involves all three of the key dimensions of a university's life, doesn't it? Teaching, research and engagement with the wider community. That we feel that as a university, it's when those three things are all at play, are all healthy. The place of the university in the wider community, the quality of its teaching, the pertinence of its research. It's when those things act together that a university is really functioning. This is the way that we express that diagrammatically at the University of Melbourne, although we often refer, instead of knowledge transfer now, we refer to engagement. I sometimes think that when universities think about those three activities, research, teaching or curriculum, and the community, they too often think about them as separate activities, when I think they should have much more overlap than that diagram suggests. Too often, it's only occasionally that we think that teaching and research overlap, or that teaching and community engagement overlap. I think that we should aim for a situation where there's much greater alignment of the university's three objectives in terms of teaching, research and engagement. Let me give you a sporting analogy about this place here where all three overlap, that I would call the sweet spot of when a university is getting it right. I know that a lot of people in this part of the world are very caught up with this Rugby World Cup. A lot of interest in rugby. Of course, I come from the southern states of Australia and think that the finals of the Australian Rules football are much more important than that. The world's attention should be focused on that. But in thinking about this sweet spot, I actually thought of another sporting analogy, and that's for all of you who've ever played cricket. Because those of you that have ever played cricket will know that on a cricket bat, about 2/3 of the way down, there is a spot that we call a sweet spot. And that very occasionally in my case, when I was a batsman, everything would come into place at exactly the right moment of timing, and the ball would hit that sweet spot 2/3 of the way down the bat and speed away to the fence. I think the sweet spot of that type in university education is when we have areas of research and teaching and community engagement that actually completely overlap. I can think of some wonderful examples in my own university where the research that people are doing informs integrally the type of learning that their students are engaged in, but it also involves the community in all sorts of interactive ways. And those are the times in my university when I think the university really has struck its sweet spot, and when people feel a real pride in what they do. Even more importantly than that, however, when we think about what the point of all this is, why we're concerned with the quality of the way we teach and the challenges that I've outlined today. I had an experience at university that I still look back on after many years as some of the best years of my life. When I look back on my years as an undergraduate and later as a graduate student, I say to myself, I think they were very, very special years in which I had the chance, before I had a whole lot of other obligations, to explore the life of the mind, to be thrilled by being taught by great teachers, to have the chance to go and discover whatever I wanted in what seemed to be extraordinary places called libraries. My ultimate goal in talking about teaching and learning is that I think from the moment that students come onto campus during orientation week to the moment they leave at the time of graduation, that this should be the sweet spot of their lives, and that they take with the memories of that into the wider community, because that is the way that we all grow in the esteem of the societies that we serve. Thank you for your attention.